So we're on the last two verses, or three verses of the Beatitudes, but it's kind of been a while since we've met and read the whole thing, so I'm just going to read all the Beatitudes up to where we're going to go, so chapter 5, verses 2 through 12. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So I'm going to focus on those last few verses about persecution, but before that, I thought we should kind of recap all the Beatitudes and remember what Dave pointed out when he spoke last on this passage. So does anyone want to share something that they remember from Dave's talk? I know it was a while ago, before the New Year. So. He spoke mainly on, I think, verses 7 through 9. But he kind of focused on blessed are the peacemakers. Does anyone want to share something that stuck out to them or that they remember? No?
I only remember the last thing he said, which was something like, what was it? It was like, think about whether you actually love Jesus or do you just love the idea of him. Was that what he said? Idea of loving him? Or idea of him?
Idea of Jesus.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that was really good.
But I don't remember what he said before that.
Okay, that's okay. So just to give an overview of what we've gone over so far, verses 3 through 8 focus on these attributes that we should try to embody. Being poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek. And these are more of character traits or who we want to be. So these are the traits that Jesus is pointing out. And then verse 9, it kind of is building up and building up. And then it goes to, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And what Dave mentioned a little bit is, this is kind of what we are to do. Once we have all these, traits within ourselves, this is kind of our action. We are to be peacemakers. We are to make peace in the world. And we talked a little bit about what that means. And so once we get to verses 10 through 12, there's a shift where this is actually what may happen to us as a result of having all these character traits and then being peacemakers. And the result is being persecuted. So I think it's kind of interesting that, these last verses that Jesus talks about, we're not really in control of. You can't really, seek out persecution. And I know some people talk about it like, oh, it's some great thing that we should try to, it's a good sign if you're persecuted. And, that might be true, but it's something that we're not in control of. It's not something that we should actively be seeking out. And it's other people's natural responses to us as Christians should we embody the previous. But I don't know about you guys, but does it strike you kind of as strange that someone would be persecuted for being a peacemaker or for being meek or poor in spirit? Those don't seem like really offensive things that someone would want to be offended by. What do you guys think? Does that strike anyone else as kind of strange?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah. So these verses are building up into the fact that other people's responses to the church body or to Christians for being, peacemakers and merciful and all these things. Their response may be to persecute Christians. And why do you think that is? Do you think that it really is offensive to be, like, mournful? Like, who would persecute someone who's in mourning, you know? Who would be like, you suck because you're mourning? Like, you're sad and you're sitting, like, who does that, you know? Or if someone's, like, merciful to someone, why would someone say that's a bad thing? Like, have you thought kind of about, or do you guys have any thoughts about that? Like, why would that be so offensive? Well, just something to chew on. And we're going to talk about that. So I questioned, you know, I was asking myself this question as I was reading this and wondering, you know, what more can we learn about the character of those being persecuted that would cause people to be so offended? And so I think the answer might lie in the last verse. And it says, at the very end of verse 12, "For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And so I thought that, you know, maybe the answer lies in who were the prophets? Like, who exactly were these people and why were they persecuted? And so, I don't know, what do you guys know about the prophets, or what do you guys think of when you hear prophet? It's kind of more of a... Huh?
What?
Prophets. I think something grace happening, like, like splitting the river, the Mississippi River or the river in half.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's a prophet, I feel like.
So maybe someone who, like, performs, like, these big, great acts, of, like, miracles, and parting the Red Sea or something like Moses.
Yeah, that's what I prophet meant.
Okay. Any other, things that come to mind when you think of the prophets?
I think of people who speak unpopular truths.
Yeah. People who speak unpopular truth.
Who, like, well, the Old Testament prophets, they're always talking about how they didn't care enough about the poor and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Old Testament prophets definitely spoke a lot about that. So,
coming destruction, and how, like, I think it was like Jeremiah, right? He was like the really, like, the weeping prophet because he was foretelling the, like, exile of the Israelites. So yeah, telling things that are not like what you want to hear.
yeah, speaking kind of a lot of wrath at times, like, yeah, things that, yeah, are unpopular to hear. So those are good. So the three things that I want to kind of point out about the prophets is, one, they spoke out against the popular culture of the day. They saw, like, a greater truth or a greater purpose, and they just saw their popular culture and just didn't like things about it, so they spoke out against that. They also spoke out not just against the greater population, but against the religiosity of the most religious people of the day. And I say religiosity kind of as a term to, you know, the kind of religious motions that a lot of, like, religious people of the day would go through, like prayer or fasting, or, like, kind of these very religious things that missed the point of what God wanted for them at that time. So one, they spoke out against the popular culture. Two, they spoke out against the religiosity of, at least in the Old Testament, the Jewish people. And then third, they pointed people to a higher purpose, or they pointed people to God. So I just kind of wanted to visit some examples of this to get a little bit more context. You mentioned that Jeremiah was like the weeping prophet, like he was always mournful, and which is one of the Beatitudes, he was mournful. They were so burdened by what they saw in their culture and their, and in the religious people, that they were so, like, Jeremiah talks about, like, I wish I could stay quiet, but God has, like, put such a heavy burden on my mouth that I can't help but, like, speak out against these injustices that I see. So, and they even embodied the injustice and oppression upon themselves. If you read some of the prophets, they talk about, like, them doing really crazy things. Like Isaiah would like walk around naked for like a long time, and it was to show like the I forget actually what it was to show. It was to basically show like
Everything.
you know it was to show everything, yes. But he was like prophesying, I think, the future that was going to happen to Israel, the way that they were going to be punished, the way they were going to be stripped, and yeah, everything. Or they would put like sackcloth on themselves. They would like put themselves in the most uncomfortable state because they were just so spiritually uncomfortable with what was going on, that they actually like were in physical pain and suffering as well. So I think that's pretty interesting and cool. So focusing on a couple of the prophets, I first wanted to look at Isaiah. And if you read Isaiah, he was living in exiled, in the time of exile. And so the Jewish people were living in Babylon. And so he spoke out against the materialism and selfishness of Babylon. And if you read through Isaiah, it's actually pretty striking how much the materialism and self-focus and individualism of Babylon kind of is really similar to our modern day culture. At least when I read it, I see a lot of reflection of our culture. Like people just didn't care about the poor. They just cared about consuming more and more for themselves. And so, one, Isaiah spoke out against that. Two, he also spoke out against like the religiosity of the people. So in chapter 58 of Isaiah, he is criticizing the Jewish people because of their fasting. And at the time, they were like going through this religious motion and fasting, but they just they'd missed the complete point of it. And the point that Isaiah pointed out in verses 6 through 8 is, he says, is this not the fast that I chose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. So he's basically saying, you guys are doing this religious thing by fasting and focusing so much on yourself, like, oh, I'm doing this spiritual thing, when they totally missed the point. They were not taking care of the other people who were right in front of them, the homeless and the poor. He says, like, do not hide yourself from your own, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. It's like you're hiding yourself from like the injustice that's right outside your door. And so Isaiah was speaking out against that. Another example that actually also relates to fasting is in Zechariah. And it's a smaller book, but it's one of my favorite prophecy books. In Zechariah, the people of Israel approach him and ask him this question. I guess they had performed this fast for many years. And, it kind of became that they were going through the motions of this fast to celebrate this occasion. And so they wanted to ask Zechariah, or to ask God through Zechariah, should we continue to do this fast like we've been doing for all these years? And Zechariah came back to them and said basically, you guys have not done this fast for God at all. You guys have done this for yourselves, and you guys have missed the point. So instead, he says in verses 9 through 10, thus says the Lord of hosts, render true judgments, show kindness and mercy to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the sojourner, or the poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. So again, the same point that Isaiah made. You guys are doing these religious motions, but you guys have forgotten to show kindness and mercy. You've forgotten about the widow, the fatherless, the foreigner, and the poor. And so, again, that he's pointing them to higher callings above their popular culture and above their religiosity. And, we read a lot of the prophets, and these are their words, but I feel like the prophets also embodied what they preached. They, tried to do their best to, live righteously, and it came from a position of humility. They realized their own, they were a part of their, popular culture. They were a part of, the religious folks of the day. And yet they were unsatisfied with what they saw. And so they came from a position of humility, but wanting what was best for the people. So going back to our verses in Matthew,